Okay, welcome to episode 107 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking to Roslyn Snyder. Roslyn is the creator of books, experiential trainings, and a practicing psychologist. After a career in applied medical science, Roslyn graduated with first class honors in psychology in 1995, focused on psycho-neurobiology and psychometrics. In 2017, she published Realm Theory and is now in the process of operationalizing realm theory. Welcome, Roslyn.
Welcome. Thank you. It's great to be here from
Yeah,
all side of the world.
yeah. Thank you, and a big thank you to Bryn for introducing us. And he talked about in the podcast I did a few months ago about you. Um, so,
Yes.
um, how I love to begin the podcast is just for you to introduce a bit of your journey. How did you get into this work, into realm theory, into psychology?
Yeah. Okay. So all my life, I sort of sensed patterns. And one of the really early memories I have is when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And my mum had brought me down into the city. And we were standing at a bus stop. And I was so high and I was holding onto my mum's hand. And this was back in the late 60s, 1960s. And there was a pub behind us. And you always knew where a pub was back then because they stunk.
Yeah.
And I looked around and there was about 4 or 5 men who were very, very drunk sitting on the pavement. And they were making quite a bit of noise. And I remember looking along this group of men, and the man at the end had this cigarette in his finger and the ash was really, really long. And I was then wondering, how did he keep the ash so long? And it started to, and then I realized it was burning his fingers. And then I looked up into his face and realized he was dead. And so there was this man in the center of Perth, dead on the pavement. And his 4 friends were just making a lot of noise and didn't even realize he was dead. And I remember at the time thinking, how can this happen? How can someone just die on the pavement and his friends not even notice? And then a little while later, the ambulance officers or police, or they were just men in uniform to me, came over and they sort of picked this man up. And they were really annoyed with the other men because they were all drunk. They hadn't even noticed that he was dead. And so that was one of the first things I sort of recognized, that there was something going on. Why were these men not reacting to their friend who had died? And I also had grown up in sort of largish families and extended family. So I was always around a lot of people. And so at one stage, I think we had about 12 people living in the house.
Wow.
So yeah, so you got to really know people. And then we moved to another house that also had about 7 people, all different generations. And this happened quite a bit through my life. And then when I was about 12, and I'd already started being very interested in psychology. I remember reading books about why people are doing the things they are doing. And I had a real interest in schizophrenia at the time, even at that age.
Wow.
And so this, and it was a Saturday morning, my friend and I were going to another friend's place, and we had to cross the schoolyard, and you're not allowed in the schoolyard, obviously. But because it was a shortcut, we'd actually removed the nails off the picket fence. And so we slid this fence across. And as we walked through, we saw this shape under a bush in the yard. And we thought we'd found a dead body. So we were pretty excited, thinking we were going to be on the news that night. But as we sort of crept over, we realized this, and it was a woman sleeping in the schoolyard under a bush. But she woke up and she was just lying there reading magazines. And I was like, what is going on? This woman is sleeping in the schoolyard, and that she must feel safer here than at home. And then she said, oh, girls, come over here. I've got some advice for you. And her advice was never marry a drunk, because she was escaping from domestic violence. Mm-hmm. And so I would see this and I'd see it was like a behavioral pattern sort of thing that I'd see all around. And so I got very good at predicting who was safe to be around, who wasn't. Sorry about that. I've had a bit of a cold over the last couple of weeks.
It's winter time there in Australia, isn't it?
Yes. It is. It's winter time. So I'd seen all these patterns, and given that I had a very up and down childhood, so both my parents were married 3 times, and over the years I have, I think, 37 stepbrothers and sisters. Wow. And things just sort of changed. By the time I got to about 12 or 13, probably 13, I was quite off the rails and started using alcohol and drugs then. And then at 15, I ended up in a really abusive relationship with a much older man who was an addict. And so I sort of lived that life for a while. And all the people I met, I sensed this pattern happening. And and so then after that sort of ended, I ended up, because I was also quite talented at school, and I skipped 2 grades of school, which was a blessing and not a blessing, because I was with a lot of older people and stuff like that. So I ended up working in doing an applied science diploma when I was 15, and then ended up working in a medical laboratory. But I worked with, it was a medical laboratory, but we had 27 medical specialists that worked in the centre, and they used to all come and congregate in the medical lab and that. And I started to realise that so I grew up in a very poor area. Sometimes we didn't always have food every night. I joke that we always had food, I shouldn't say that, but like we'd have mashed potato on toast for dinner sometimes. So I grew up in that sort of area, and then I was working with all these medical specialists that were earning a lot of money. But I'd see this same pattern, and because I'd studied the science and that, I was like, there's something else going on. And then I decided to enroll in psychology. In the meantime, I got married and had a couple of children. And so at the ripe old age of 21, I had already had 2 children and enrolled at university and study psychology so I could find out what this pattern was. And after 6 years of doing my degree, which I learnt lots of stuff, I still didn't know what this pattern was. Mm-hmm. And I'd always seen it, and it enabled me to do lots of things and see, as I said before, I knew who was safe, who wasn't, very quickly and easily. I also knew, like, when things were about to happen. So, like at school, when there was going to be a fight, I knew you could feel it. And so I knew this pattern was happening. And so it was about 6 months after I graduated psychology, I actually had a dream, and I dreamt a thing called a map. Mm-hmm. And the map is actually a metaphor for the emotional landscape. And one of the first people I showed was an Aboriginal elder. And he actually gave my business my name, because he said, how does someone so young have so much wisdom in their life? And it became wisdom. And that became the basis of a suicide prevention program for young people. Because in the map, there's basically 3 places that people get stuck in the map where they are likely to suicide. One's at the depths of despair in the swamp of feelings. So that's been really, really overwhelmed emotionally. So your typical clinical depression. The second place is stuck in the anger and guilt mudflats. So if you think about that, if you've ever walked through thigh-deep mud, you use a lot of energy and don't get anywhere. And that place is all about blame. So the anger, you'll blame other people, and underneath you'll have guilt that you blame yourself. So sometimes people will suicide there. And that's for a very different reason than being overwhelmed with emotion. That's to punish someone, usually. And the third place in the map was a place called the Desolate Desert. And this is a place where people don't have any connections to anyone or anything. This is the area that most mental health services and counselling services and that do not deal with very well at all, because people can appear very educated, very together, and they're also more likely to have a suicide attempt today, go to hospital and be able to talk their way out of it. Oh, it was accidental, I didn't really mean it. Because in the Desolate Desert, you don't have a connection to yourself, so you don't have a connection to what you're thinking and feeling. And so what I realized was that's actually what I made my career out of, really, is connecting with people that are actually in the Desolate Desert and helping them heal by connecting. So that was the map, which totally changed my life, because up until that point, I was totally science orientated. And then all of a sudden I had to understand and deal with emotions. And I ended up developing a whole series of, I suppose, healing programs. And I ended up writing that into a book, and then I wrote another couple of books. And it was while I was running one of those healing programs that there was a psychology student in the group, and she saw how quickly and easily people's lives transformed. And she was like, I've never seen anything like this. So she decided that she would do her doctoral thesis on the theory underlying this simple map. Yep. And so when she came to do that, as part of it, she interviewed me. And she said to me, whenever you present this map, you always say it's a mathematical model. What would that look like? And I said, well, the map's like a graph. It's like a 4-dimensional graph in my mind. And as I said the words 4-dimensional, I was like, there's something deeper to it than that. And so then it started me on a whole nother journey into, so yeah, you can see that my journey's never been planned out. It's just sort of gone wherever it's gone. And I started researching what is the underlying pattern to the map. And that's where realm theory comes from. But I actually enrolled to do a PhD because I wanted to unify psychology at that stage. And so I started reading, I probably read close to 1,000 books.
1,000. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm a very fast reader, and I read books on chaos theory, complexity theory, quantum physics, string theory, brain theory, then went into the infinite mathematics and also all the work in consciousness and trauma of the brain and the neurobiology, because I was still always interested in, and this comes back to the healing, is that if you don't know what's happening in the brain biologically, well, psychobiologically, then how are you going to transform it and heal it? So also during this time, I was doing my own healing journey from my childhood and my, I suppose you'd say, intergenerational trauma, because my mum was actually a 17-year-old and she ran away from home when she got pregnant with me. And that's impacted her life and it's obviously impacted mine. And so I was doing all these art-based things to heal myself. And so so Wisdom in Your Life uses some art, song, dance, story, as well as language to heal. And what we're actually doing is connecting the left hemisphere with the right hemisphere, the conscious with the unconscious, the brainstem with the emotional, with the cognitive, because a healthy mind has multiple connections. And what happens when we have trauma or abuse, and it happens with depression, anxiety, and probably most diagnosable mental health conditions, is we develop what's called a closed loop in our neural pathways. And if you think about a roundabout on a road, yep, and you drive in, well, these closed loops are like roundabouts with no exits. And so once something gets triggered, you get into this closed loop, and it may be a thought loop where you just have you get that obsessive thinking and you can't get yourself out of it. Or it might be a feeling. So it might be that overwhelming feeling of dread, and that's in a closed loop. It could be an action. And it's like with an addiction or any of those, you have to do that behavior. So understanding that, and that our brain, our verbal centers in our brain are so small. So talking therapies aren't going to access any trauma that you've had before the age of 12, because the networks just aren't there. And so, so all our programs use all those modalities. So I had been practicing that throughout. And I remember the day, I was 32 years old, when I went, oh my God, I am fully healed. There is nothing else that I need to do for myself. Doesn't mean my healing journey was over, because then we had to do the generational stuff. But for me, that's when I knew it was totally fine. And that's where I got my, I suppose, robustness from, right? So now I've lost my train, which also allowed me to go into places like maximum security prison and run programs with men who won't ever get out of prison. It allowed me to go into the juvenile justice system. It allowed me to go to very remote communities where there's a lot of domestic violence and alcohol and drugs. And yeah, so that robustness of that healing carried on. So then I went back to uni, did all this study. And because realm theory connects everything into one pattern, and I like to say that the pattern is the web of life, right? And it's an energy pattern. And each entity, and a person is an entity, a company is an entity, a family is an entity, a country is an entity, and then obviously animals and all of that. Every entity has a nature, place, and purpose. And when we connect to our nature, place, and purpose and don't have anything blocking our energy paths through our body, through our mind, that's when we're fully healed. And so for the last 30 years, that's what I've been doing with people, connecting them to their truth. That's the deepest knowing. So, and it's all in one pattern called realm theory. The art behind me is the artistic interpretations of realm theory. Yeah. And that's about 20 years worth of work.
Wow, amazing. I love it. Yeah, it reminds me of the Aboriginal painting I saw in places like Alice Springs.
Yeah. Yeah. So so I did all this scientific study, like into all the science and that. And I must say, I never completed my PhD because it connected too many modalities that it didn't fit within any one faculty. So I've written a mathematical proof and I've written papers on it. And now what I'm doing is I'm just going to write a series of books that explains each little bit for people. All along that journey, at least half my clinical work has been with Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal people. And Australian Aboriginal people are the oldest living culture in the world. And there's still debate about how long they've actually been here. If you talk to the elders, they will say they've got stories back from way before the Ice Age and stuff like that. And they actually will say it's longer than 65,000 years. The scientists have dated certain things 65,000 years, but the stories go way beyond that. So, and what I discovered is that the Aboriginal way of being was this pattern, realm theory. They actually lived it. So I had the science and the understanding of it, but they actually just put it into practice.
Fascinating. It's almost like the left and the right hemispheres connecting.
Absolutely. And so,
and analytical.
Yeah. So the Aboriginal artwork is teaching you an aspect of the way of life. And that's why it's so appealing to so many people. Because, so realm theory also combines science, arts, and spirituality, right? And I say it's all about, so quantum chaos is the way life works. And there's scientific principles and I do training on that, but I'm not going to talk about all of that today. But so there's the science, but the art gives us an experience of the spirituality, which is the connection of all things. And we are all connected in this one pattern. And it's an energy pattern all across the world.
It's interesting how art is somehow dismissed. It's kind of seen as less than, and certainly now in the UK, a lot of schools, they're moving to more mathematics and science, and a lot of the softer subjects like art or languages, certain languages are, not being taught as much. And it's almost, and I found that in my own healing journey is I got really into art and poetry. My Jungian analyst I worked with got me, I was just painting in black and white. She said, what about some color? And I'm like, well, I haven't perfected black and white. She said, I'd suggest. And as soon as I did, it was like, the joy of life. I'd been living in black and white because of my childhood trauma. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that some of our greatest scientists also painted. So I paint for the interpretation of what I see. So then that then becomes a concept that I can actually teach. And so what I say, so realm theory allows me to have a structured worldview and also be able to teach it for the Western mind, which is been trained for the last, I don't know, couple of thousand years to think in a particular way. And so that's what I'm, I suppose, trying to do, is because when you can see, it actually goes over 11 dimensions.
Okay. Realm
theory. So our consciousness needs to connect to 11 dimensions, and then we can be very whole and complete, but also knowing which dimensions you shouldn't connect to, because that can create problems. And that all comes from your deepest knowing. And so the only way we get to our deepest knowing is through arts.
So it's almost like we've got to balance out, and I just see that in the West, we're so unbalanced just on one side of the brain, the left,
Yes.
the analytical, and forgotten the master in the emissary. The name's gone from my head. He talks a lot about brain science, and the brain says, the right side is the more intuitive, the creative side, and we're just not nurturing that side.
Well, and also so much of the Western world focuses on what we call verbal consciousness. The stuff we're aware of that we can talk about, right? That's about 10% of our mind's capability. And so the Aboriginal people I work with talk about the 90% world.
Okay.
And so the 10% world uses our 5 senses, which is taste, touch, sight, hearing, and taste. The 90% world uses the 5 modalities of art, song, dance, story, and language.
Art, song, dance,
story, and language.
Right, beautiful.
Right? And the language, so I think there's over 200 Aboriginal languages, but it's a vibration rather than the words, and they often mimic the sounds of nature. So that language does something deep inside our brain. And so often when I worked with people, and especially children, but even some adults, we hardly talk about any of it. We might be talking about one thing, but they're drawing something else. And so I have this very structured 3-stage process for healing.
I'd love for you to go into that, because you mentioned that talk therapy, doesn't access the memories before 12, So I'd love you to share a little, because I found similar myself when I went and did counseling, psychotherapy. It didn't work for me. I could just talk, but I couldn't access my feelings.
No.
When I worked with a Jungian analyst, I worked with my dreams, and I was painting, I was drawing. That's when my emotion and my disassociation started to heal.
Yes, totally. So we run 3 workshops. Each one goes for 2 days. Although when people are really, really shattered, we do it over 6 days, but just a few hours each day. So the first workshop is the map that I talked about. And what we're actually doing is teaching people processes to heal, right? So we do not sit around in a group talking about what we've been through. Because when we talk about it, we actually can re-traumatize ourselves, but we can also traumatize other people in the group. So we will do very simple activities but they're all structured and streamlined together. But one of them I'll just share so you get an idea. I have a stick figure, so just a person, and we have 9 different colors of that, and people get to choose what color they want. And then on there, using crayon, I just get them to draw whereabouts in their body they feel stress. Whereabouts in their body do they feel sadness? Whereabouts do you feel fear? And we do about 9 feelings, right? And these feelings aren't attached to any actual events at this stage, right? And then we paint each of those feelings out until, well, we usually just do one feeling in the workshop. But when I work with children, often that is all we do. We paint it until they don't feel it anymore, because all the emotion that we hold on to is energy. And one thing about energy is it needs to move, right?
Yeah.
So we teach that process first. So the process goes acknowledge what you're feeling, where you're feeling it, express it. So we draw it, paint it. And then the third step is to let that feeling go. We're not letting go the event, because we can't change the event, all the events. And I know you talk about the whole boarding school experience. We can't change that, but the feelings attached to it, we can move through. I'm not saying it's easy at all. It's a simple process. Then within the map, then we go to the places that people actually get stuck. And I talked about it before, like the bottom of the swamp, which is the depths of despair. And we have something, we teach the process of how to get out of there. The anger and guilt, and it's in the anger and guilt that we end up with the dissociation that you talked about. And what actually happens is our actions, our thinking, and our feeling dissociate from one another.
Yeah.
And then within there, they can also dissociate down, right? So we teach processes of bringing that back together. There's also another cycle that we teach, and that cycle in the anger and guilt underlies a lot of domestic violence, a lot of addictions, and a lot of self-harming in all its forms, not just that. Then there's another place called avoidance, where we actually shut down our feelings and we spend all our time thinking about everything. And Bryn, who you interviewed before, he talks about, you know, he was 100% convinced he could think his way through anything, but it doesn't work.
No,
It does not work.
That's the Western society. We've dissociated from emotion. We try to think through things.
And it doesn't work. And so the map very clearly says that when something happens, right, you feel first. That's the swamp of feelings. And you do what I call swim the swamp, which is acknowledge, express, and let go. Then on the other side of the swamp, we get to the forest of hope. The forest of hope is the time where we rest and reflect. This is the only place we learn. And this is where we bring in the thinking, right? So when things happen to us, we have to feel first, then think, then we start up the rocky paths where we start exploring what we can do. And that's when the actions come in. And then we get to the Seymour Mountains at the top, where we can actually see more clearly and make a decision and step off, right? And so over 2 days, we teach the map how to get out of each place, how to move through it, so that people have this toolkit of what to do. So that's the first workshop we do. The second workshop we do is called the Compass, and this is where we connect to your core energy pattern, right? Now, from realm theory, I've identified that there's 8 different cores. And so basically what we're doing is developing a deep connection to your deepest self, right? So we have our actions on top. Underneath that, we have our thinking. Now, most therapy looks at the mental impact or the thinking, but underneath our thinking, we have feelings. And then underneath feelings, we have distorted energy patterns or false beliefs, which aren't the false beliefs of just being able to think and say. They're a really deep one. And so so the third workshop is about repatterning that pattern that you've taken on. So I had taken on a pattern of that when things happen to me, my very first action, my very first thought is, I don't have to put up with this, I'm leaving. So my whole pattern is to run away from everything. Of course I don't, but I've been actually married now for 42 years.
Wow.
And still to this day, that pattern exists, which I learnt from my mum, right? That's what I mean. It's really deeply in there. Now I can laugh at it because it occurs and I go, well, you're not going to leave. You haven't left after all this time. You're not going to leave. But that is my very first feeling and sense to do. And so the other thing I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. In the second workshop, we talk about, we have the compass is made up of a sphere of knowledge, and that's what we've learnt over our life. So that's the nurture part of our life. And at the center, we have the core nature, which is our nature. And we try to balance and integrate that. So you end up with a strong sense of who you are.
It's like reconnecting to that deepest self. And I feel one of the key things with trauma or even, boarding school is that we totally disconnect from our deepest self because it is not accepted and we're punished if we connect into that. So to reconnect to our hearts and our deepest self is very beautiful.
And how often is it acceptable anywhere in the world?
Well,
in the Western world, right? You go into business, leave your personal stuff out the door.
Well, I just feel business is a reflection of almost the colonial world, and Nick Duffel talks about that. It's kind of come in. So that's why we've got to leave everything outside in business. It's not heart-centered. It's changing.
Yeah. And so the second workshop is very much about that. The third workshop is called Healing the Energy Patterns of Trauma and Abuse, right? And this is looking at the impact that the trauma and or abuse has happened over your life. And we look at it in terms of ages, because trauma and abuse that happens under the age of 3 will have a very different impact than that between 3 and 7, 7 and 12, 12 and 18, 18 and 25, right? And so just for example, trauma and abuse that happens between 3 and 7 really impacts us at the emotional level. Whereas between 7 and 12, it's often a very physical impact. But then once you've had a trauma, it carries on to all the others. And so over the first day of that workshop, we actually map where the trauma and abuse has impacted your life. So we go around the whole compass. So we look at, how does it impact your thinking? How does it impact you spiritually? How does it impact you emotionally? How does it impact you socially? How does it impact your environment? And we also do these masks. So we get people to create a mask which is their real face of trauma.
Mm.
If all the trauma and abuse that you went through was on your face, what would it look like?
Mm.
Because we can only change something, and we've learnt this from the MAP workshop, once we acknowledge it.
Mm.
Right? So, you know, it's quite common to go, oh, I've just put my trauma and my abuse in this little box and we'll bury it over there. But as you know, and probably most of your listeners know, the impact still happens, whether it's buried in a box or whether you're thinking about it every day. The impact happens.
Mm.
And so then on the second day, and this is by far the most intuitive workshop we do, because people have that deeper connection, what we say we do is we get them to play in a sand tray.
Beautiful.
Right? And so each person will have their own little sand tray. We have all these little things that represent different things for them. And we also have the paints. And so basically they play in this sand tray until they put themselves back together.
Amazing. That's incredible.
And people always go, oh, the trauma and abuse workshop must be so hard. That's actually probably the easiest.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've dealt with the emotions of it in the first one. In the second, we've anchored them to themselves. And this third one, it's like, yeah, I just want it all gone.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have to get into the story of what's happened to us,
Mm-hmm.
because we're just looking at the impact. So,
wow, yeah, fascinating. I've got so many strands I could go off on that.
yeah. And so, this is what we've done. I've done this in maximum security prison,
Really?
where people have said, you cannot do this in this place because it's not safe for men to express. Well, I can tell you, it was the biggest learning of my entire life to work with a group of 9 men who most had never talked about or never even shown anything. And like, they didn't talk about it. They just did it in the paintings and that. And the compassion that the men had for one another was unbelievable. So I'll just, can I share?
Of course, go for it.
Yeah. So one of the men in the group had done horrific crimes, and he never ever had acknowledged what he had done. Right? His family were so worried about him. His brothers and cousins and that were committing crimes so they could go into the prison to look after him. Right? And so when, we had got them all to draw on there where they felt things, and then they were painting. And we always offer the chance to share your paintings. Everything we do is optional. We never make anyone do anything. But I encourage people to talk about their paintings, because that's taking it from the non-verbal unconscious into the verbal conscious. Right? So we're connecting. Mm-hmm. And as you said, the left and the right, but it's the whole thing. And so at first one of the men sort of shared, and he said, this is me when I went to the beach. I'm like, knowing it's nothing to do with what he's done. And then this one man who'd never shared anything, he goes, I'm going to share something. And he pulled up his painting and he said, this is my soul burning in hell for what I have done. And he started crying all the other men came and they all touched his shoulders. And, the officer that was in there, he was crying. And so we had these 9 men crying. And then all of the men were sharing not their story, but the impact of what had happened. But this man whose soul was burning in hell for what he had done, he had painted 7 paintings going back. And I don't know what happened to him, but he said, this all started when I was 4 years old. And I lost myself. And this is, I suppose, an interesting observation. I don't have any scientific evidence other than all the men I've worked with that have murdered people all had a very significant event that we would call like a soul death between the ages of 4 and 7.
Interesting. I interviewed a clinical psychologist, forensic psychologist who's worked in prisons for years. She said very similar thing. Often she found that those men who'd committed the worst crimes had had something really terrible happen to them.
Yeah.
When they
And
were
but it was
very young.
between 4 and 7. And that is a very critical age. But it's like they've lost a part of themselves. So when we do the repatterning in the 3rd stage, what we actually do is also bring back part of ourselves that's been taken or destroyed. As well as, and so with abuse, often the abuser takes a part of you, right? And you take on some of the energy of that abuser.
So I have a question. I think a lot of my listeners say they've been to boarding school, they've had some form of childhood trauma. The biggest issue is when we have been abused or we have some form of trauma, we go, yes, that happened to me.
Yeah.
But with the boarding school side, you're told it's a privilege, it's a great thing. So therefore, there's this inner conflict that, oh no, it was good. But actually, age 7, suddenly to lose your family, age 7, I have literally 30 books above me here of leaders, people who are very well known. And David Cameron, age 7, he lost a quarter of his body weight in boarding school because they were feeding him rice and maggots.
Yes.
And so what my question is if you've been told it's a great thing and you can't even acknowledge the trauma, how do we deal with that?
Well, we do things like this and say, well, if it's locked away, it is having an impact. And, where it has an impact depends on the person, because people either do it internally or externally. So it'll be within themselves or within relationships or their surroundings. And so, if you have people making decisions, like major decisions, who have been through that, it's problematic. And we have the same thing here in terms, so I don't know if you've heard of the stolen generation.
Yeah, I tried to interview one of the ladies who spoke about that, but yeah, please.
Yeah. So this is with Aboriginal families. So during the some would argue it's still happening today, because more children are being removed from their families than ever before. But in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, we had the White Australia policy. And so any child of mixed parentage who was Aboriginal was removed from their family. And so many of the kids were told this is the best thing for you. And you will still have people today growing up on the mission was great, right? Because it gave me an education, it gave me this, it gave me that. And you always have these two sides of people saying it was a privilege and those that were saying it was terrible. But we've recently had a royal commission into what happened in these missions, and it's absolutely horrific. Mm-hmm. And there's still a group that will defend it, who went through it, but they're now starting to acknowledge that it wasn't good for everyone.
It's almost like that 10% of the cognitive.
Yeah. Yes.
It's fine, but they kind of totally disassociated. Well, what did that feel like? Judith Herman in her book says, actually, when you see someone traumatized or you see someone being beaten or abused, that traumatizes you just as much because of mirror neurons. Yes. So those people who say it didn't affect them.
Yeah. And what we have to do is disassociate from it. And so what happens is, how I said it impacts physical, mental, all the way down. Mm-hmm. We basically cut off a part of our life.
We do.
And we just don't go there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So there's no easy answer, but the more people become aware of it impacting, and often when you can't see it in yourself, you can see it in others.
You can, yeah.
Right?
That's why relationships are so hard. It's like them.
Yeah. And when I first did my book, I had so many letters going, I could see everyone in my family everywhere in the book. And then I reread it a second time and went, oh, that's me.
Yeah.
Because we don't, and it's really hard to admit something like boarding school because your parents who love you sent you there, right? I'm not saying they weren't, but to say it wasn't good when generations have gone, then that's like saying my family's not good.
It's much easier for us to go, I'm not good.
I'm not good. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And it is so much easier to do that than actually go, my family is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is in your kind of workshops or what you're teaching is this idea we connect more in with story, with art, with sing.
Oh, yeah.
Connecting in with that other 90%.
Yes, very much so.
Rather than just getting lost in the cognitive. Part of my journey, obviously I did a lot of painting in the monastery, but then after I left, I spent a couple of years, I had a big studio and I painted so much. I mean, I've shown this on my podcast before, if you can see it. That's one of my paintings.
Wow.
And I've got hundreds up in my attic, but I've stopped painting as much recently.
Yep.
And I miss it.
Yeah. So I have paintings on the other wall that show my fragmentation, right? They're not part of the realm theory and the journey within, because that's my healing wall over the other side. But once I was healed, then I used painting for inspiration rather than therapy. And so this is where we can go from, so we heal, we connect, we integrate, all of us, and then we go to the expansion phase.
Okay.
And so that's when we can start to expand our consciousness to actually be able to see the 11 dimensions, plus to make, and this is I suppose my dream is to have leaders being able to see those 11 dimensions. So see what their decisions are going to have the ramifications of, but also 7 generations back and 7 generations forward.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we will start to have more human-centered leadership or visions or that. And so, yeah. So, yes, I do the healing, but I actually have the 3 areas: healing, the rebirth of humanity, and then the third one is reimagining the universe, all in alignment. Because if we as humans understood that there's laws of nature that connect us all, but so many things that we do violate those laws, and the only outcome when we violate any laws of quantum chaos is we isolate. And how many people are isolated today? We fragment and we eventually disintegrate. And you could argue, lots of our societies are starting to disintegrate. We have, and who is impacted the most? Our young people. And I think it was only this week the World Health Organization's put out a big warning about the mental health of young people. And, but we're not doing any of this deeper connection within ourselves, because when we connect deep within ourselves, then we can connect with others. And that's how we rebuild the social fabric. So.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah. I mean, as you mentioned about the painting, it's like to do it to the next level, to actually paint. And I really feel I've spoken to the author Rod Boothroyd on this podcast about the archetypes.
Yes.
And the sovereign is that idea of the vision, reimagining. And I really see that that's where we're transitioning, is we've got to have an amazing vision for the future. Because if we, it's like we've got to do that. The elders, in order for that to be birthed.
Yeah, absolutely. And see, my purpose in all of this is to teach people how to connect within and between, to get those networks happening.
So as we start to wrap up to that, I know we could talk for hours. What would you say to people to help them to reconnect? Just to begin with that, what would you say would be really a useful practice, a tool, an exercise?
Get a visual diary, which is just you get them from art shops with blank paper and a set of texters, and just start doodling.
Beautiful.
The other one you can do, which is a quick technique to just bring yourself back to yourself. And this actually came from Carl Jung. So my first clinical supervisor was a Jungian analyst. And it's a really simple activity. You draw a circle and color it in. And it brings you back into you.
Interesting. I'd show you something. I have a drawer full of, I doodle, not every day, I more paint, but I have all of these things where I do circles using both my hands and I fill them in.
Yeah. Okay. So that's bringing you back into yourself. And if you don't have, so this is what I taught some of the young people in like the juvenile justice, because they don't have pens, but if you just imagine yourself doing it, it works just as well.
That's lovely. Yeah. So just drawing a circle and then
coloring it in. Whatever color you want, multiple colors if you want. and it just brings you back into you.
Yeah. So where can people buy your books? Are they available on your website or?
They are available on my website. They're getting all republished, and probably they should have been there. Probably in the next 2 months, they'll all be up on Amazon.
Okay.
I'm also do training, because what I'm doing is licensing people to run my programs. That's my next big push. So,
and do you just do that in Perth, or can people do it online?
we can't do it online as such yet. I do have training courses, just half-day ones that are available online about realm theory and some professional development and stuff. But I've traveled all across Australia to run the training, and me or Bryn, or we would travel anywhere.
Right.
So I have 3 or 4 people that work for me. So yeah, if you had 12 people or 10 people who wanted to do the training, we could come to England, or anywhere in the world.
Right.
Or you could come down here.
Yeah,
I
I have not visited, as I was saying when I began. I went 4 times from the age of 6, and I haven't been since age 24.
Yeah.
So yeah, Western Australia. Heard it's beautiful down there. Fremantle.
Yeah, that's where we are, just near Fremantle. And yeah, the West Coast is very, very different from the East Coast.
I bet you it's very different from when I was there 30 years ago. It was very touristy then, but
Yeah.
I did love it. So
Yeah.
so I'll put into the description your website, wisdominyourlife.com.au, and also roslynsnyder.com. And yeah, any other ways people can connect to you?
I'm on LinkedIn. Roslyn Snyder, and Wisdom in Your Life is on LinkedIn. We do have a Facebook page, but I have to admit, I don't look at the Facebook page at all, but it's Wisdom in Your Life Facebook page. Oh, and we have a YouTube channel, Wisdom in Your Life YouTube channel. So we have a few videos up of a few different things. Bryn's done a few more of them, and yeah.
Right. Well, it's been a real pleasure speaking to you today, Roslyn.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your time and the work.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yep. Thank you very much. This has been really joyful. Thanks.
Pleasure. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.